Hello, dear friends. Today is the 23rd of August, 2025 year, and this is a traditional overview of the map of hostilities. As of today, there are not many changes coming through the line of contact, since today is the weekend. Many bankers do not share much information these days, but still there are changes. The main changes for today are taking place in Gulie-Polski, Yuzhno-Donetsk, Pokrovsky and Sumy directions, which we will talk about and look at in this video. And before we start, according to tradition, I would sincerely like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. With your subscription, you will greatly help the development of the channel. And if this is not your first time watching these videos and you are not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe. Thank you to everyone who subscribed. And let's start with the Kherson direction. Today, we will run very quickly along the entire line of contact. Today, over the past day, one arrival was recorded in the Antonovka area. And no more news was received from this area of hostilities. Let me remind you that here, along the entire line of combat contact, both Ukrainian buckets are working on the positions of the Russians and Russian ones on the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. We are moving on with you to the Orekhovsky direction. Here too, no major changes have been recorded for today. Fighting is underway in the area of Malaya Tokmachka and in the area of Maly Sherbakov. Here are the small Sherbaks, and here is the small Tokmachka. Positional combat operations are underway. And let's move on to the Gulie-Polski direction. There are small changes here today in favor of the Russian army, but these changes were recorded yesterday and today. Additional material came from this point. Here, the Russian military was attacked by the AFU in the northern part of Temirovka, and it is reported that the Russian troops expanded the control zone to 1.5 kilometers in this area of hostilities, and actually reached the opposite settlement. So far, no video materials have been received from the reverse, but in the next 2 or 3 days, video materials will most likely arrive from here, and we will make changes to the map. For today, there are such news in this direction. Let's move on with you. Andreyevka, Krivtsova, and Tolstoy are still in question. There is a lot of dubious information coming in here, so you should not believe me or any other military officers. Because there is a lot of information here, a lot of stuffing from the AFU, and there is a lot of information from the pro-Russian side. Therefore, here you need to wait for additional materials to make changes to the map. So far, Tolstoy has been marked in the gray zone, but from this point came a video footage showing the advanced positions of the Ukrainian military. Thus, the transition of the Tolstoy settlement in favor of the APU has been noted so far, but many pro-Russian sources report that these videos were filmed in advance, while this settlement was still under the control of the APU. We are waiting for additional materials from Andreyevka, Krivtsov, and Tolstoy, and will make changes to the map. There is also video footage from this point. The positions of the Russian armed forces were attacked here by the AFU. Also, Russian troops attacked the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine in the area of the settlement of Filay. Here, a blow was struck at the point of temporary deployment of the APU with the help of an F drone. Otherwise, there are no changes here for today. And there are changes in the area of the settlement successful. As you know, earlier Russian troops took the southern part of Udakny to the railway. This is how this territory was controlled by the Russians. Then it was reported that most of Udakny came under the control of the Russian military, and the fighting was conducted in the northern outskirts. But today, the video material came from this point. Here, Russian troops advanced 400 meters north of the railway station, and the entire territory marked in red came under the control of the Russians. Everything is going to the point that successfully in the next week, it may already come under the full control of the Russian military, if the APU does not attempt to counterattack. As for Kotlino, there are no changes and news here for today. We are moving with you to the Pokrov direction. There have been no major changes here for today, and there is no news either. There is news that Russian positions have been attacked near the village of Lysovka. Here, the APU attacked the positions of the Russian armed forces with the help of F drones. Several attacks from the AFU were repulsed. And let's move on along the map. As of today, there have been reports that Pankovka has come under the full control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Also, the lighthouse came under the full control of the Russians. And from this point, a video material came in which the positions of the Russians are being attacked by the AFU F drones. And the entire territory marked in red is now completely under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, and has been completely cleared. Here the advance was up to 2 kilometers. But let me remind you that earlier, from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, more precisely, a few days ago, 3 days ago, information was received that Pankovka had come under the control of the Russians. And now there are attacks on Vladimirovka. Also, Russian troops are bypassing from the flanks the settlement of Shakov, and, perhaps in the coming days, the assault actions of both Shakov and Vladimirovka will begin. As for this ledge, many people call it a rabbit ledge because here you can see the rabbit's head and ears. There has been no serious news here for today, and no changes have been received either. Let me remind you that the Russian troops are located in Petrovka, and the attacks were on the settlement of Maryevka. There were also attacks on the settlement of Rubeznaya, Steps and Volnaya. Here, Russian troops have expanded their flanks, but so far we are not making changes to the map. Since there are no materials confirming the advance of Russian forces, we move on with you to Toretsk. Today, there was information that the armed forces of the Russian Federation completely cleaned up and took Katerinovka. This information appeared in the form of news. I also remind you that earlier there was information that the Klibin Bull came under the control of the Russians. And earlier there was information that Sherbanovka was completely cleaned and came under the control of the Russian military. Here we see that the Russian troops physically cut off the supply road to Sherbanovka. And all the AFU fighters who were in this area of hostilities were actually cut off from supplies and were surrounded. We can, of course, assume that this territory has already been cleared, completely cleared, and has come under the control of the Russians. But there has been no confirmation of this information so far. And changes to the map are made only after receiving confirmation information. Also, at this point, the positions of the APU were struck, more precisely, the APU armored vehicles with the help of an F-drone. Otherwise, here for today without any serious progress. We move on with you to the chapel. There was a video here today from this point here, the positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation were attacked by the AFU. Otherwise, there are no changes here. But let me remind you that yesterday there was information that Russian troops have already entered Mayskoye and are storming this settlement. In the coming days, we will see the results of these assault actions. We are moving with you further along the map to the Seversk direction. There are no changes here today either, but news is coming that the Serebryansky forest is being actively cleaned up, and the whole area is actually being cleaned up to the very Serebryanka. And there is information that Russian troops are also clearing a pocket between the settlement of Torskaya and here in this area of hostilities and are moving towards Serebryanka. Thus, we can conclude that in the coming weeks, in the next week, maybe two, the entire Serebryansky forest will be cleared and will come under the control of the Russian military, and there will remain a small section of the territories of the Luhansk region, which is under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. This is this area of military operations, which is under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. After it is cleaned up and taken under the control of the Russians, the Luhansk region will completely come under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. As for the Krasnolomensky direction, there was information that the well came under the control of the Russians. But let me remind you that the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation announced a week ago that Kolodezi is already under the control of the Russian military. This information is not recognized by Ukrainian sources, and no information has appeared confirming the expansion of the control zone and the taking of the well under full control. Therefore, we are waiting for video materials with the installation of flags or confirming information from this area of hostilities in order to make changes to the map. Otherwise, there are positional combat operations here. The same applies to the Kopensky direction. Positional combat operations are conducted here without any changes on the map. There are also positional combat operations in the Kharkiv direction and positional combat operations in Volchansk and the Lipetsk direction. As of today, there has been no news from here, and there have been no changes. And there are changes in the Sumy direction. We turn to the Sumy direction. Here, Russian troops took control of Yunakovka after all, or rather most of Yunakovka. Yesterday, we received video material from this point. Earlier it was reported that Russian troops are fighting positional battles for virtually every house, moving, gradually advancing in this locality. Last night, a video came from this point, where the advanced positions of the Russians were located. And this morning, the video material came from this point, from the southern outskirts of Yunakovka. Thus, we can note that most of Yunakovka is actually under the control of Russian forces. Here the advance was up to 1.5 kilometers, but still the Ukrainian military are most likely present on the outskirts. And it's a matter of time to take Yunakovka under full control, since the Ukrainian military will not be able to actually hold it. And perhaps at the beginning of next week, we will already see the transition of Yunakovka, the complete transition of Yunakovka, under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. As for the offensive of the Ukrainian military on Alexeyevka and Konstantinovka, here the Ukrainian military got stuck, and, in fact, Russian troops are now in Alexeyevka. And the Ukrainian military failed to take Alexeyevka under their control, despite the fact that Kondratovka and Andriivka came under the control of the AFU. Here fierce fighting is underway south of Novonikalayevka. This is where Novonikalayevka is located, and opposition fighting is being conducted somewhere in these forest belts. Otherwise, there were no changes on the map either. And as for the settlement of Tetkina, there are also ongoing FP duels between the Ukrainian and Russian military. The Ukrainian military is attacking the positions of the Russians in Tetkino itself. The Russian military is attacking the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine in these settlements. And the rest of the news here is for today. Thank you all for watching. See you again.